Hey everyone, we're starting off tonight with a real story that will stick with you forever. Peter Abelard, a skilled teacher, was castrated by his student's uncle in 1140 because he dared to fall in love with her. What's more startling about this? She made the decision to love him forever. What if I told you that hundreds of people were put to death in medieval times just for marrying someone their family didn't approve of? And this is going to blow your mind. People who were prohibited from ever touching one another again wrote the most fervent love letters in history. Here's what would make my night before we get into these amazing true stories. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if this makes you shiver, which I can assure you it will. Here's what I'm truly interested in, though. What time is it at the moment where you are? In California, are you comfortable in bed? Perhaps it's coffee time in London. I appreciate that we are all sharing these stories together, so please include your time zone in the comments. Let's turn down the lights, settle down, and go back in time to a period when falling in love could actually cost you your entire life. Imagine this. Love is a given in the year 1200 where you live. It's illegal. Literally, not figuratively. Choosing your heart against your family's wishes may result in exile, disinheritance, or worse in medieval Europe. Furthermore, the data derived from surviving court records are astounding. Unauthorized weddings had disastrous outcomes for the majority of those involved, according to historians who examined hundreds of medieval papers. When I initially discovered this, I was astonished by this. People in the Middle Ages didn't merely put themselves in danger for love. They put everything on the line: their futures, their families, and occasionally their lives. Still, they went ahead and did it. You keep asking yourself what type of love could possibly be worth taking such a huge risk. Allow me to illustrate your contemporary dating dilemma in a way that will make it look endearing. Your parents recently announced your engagement to a stranger, and you are 14 years old, which is, in fact, deemed marriageable age. They might be twice your age. They might be located hundreds of kilometers distant. It's possible that they don't even understand your language. This is the bit that would surprise us now, though. There was no real way to refuse. This has nothing to do with happiness or compatibility. Marriage was straightforward and business-related. The Catholic Church, which dominated almost every area of daily life, had extremely particular views on marriage and love. They taught that the main purposes of marriage were to forge alliances and have legal heirs. Passionate love, especially between married couples, can be spiritually hazardous because it diverts people's attention from God, according to St. Augustine, one of the most famous theologians in the Church. Consider it this way. What if your board of directors, who were more concerned with business alliances than your emotional health, had to approve every love choice you made? In essence, that was a medieval marriage. Most folks just couldn't afford the luxury of having your heart. However, this is where human nature becomes incredibly obstinate. People want something more fervently when it is prohibited. This is known as reactance hypothesis in modern psychology. In fact, our desire for something increases when we are informed we cannot have it. Although they were unaware of the science underlying it, medieval people were undoubtedly affected. Everything was further complicated by the structure of social classes. It was more than just improper social climbing if you were a peasant, as 90% of people were, and you fell in love with a member of the nobility. It was interpreted as an assault on the natural order created by God. People who ventured to love above their station have been known to face harsh penalties. Political unions gave rise to a unique form of heartache. In essence, princesses and noble daughters served as negotiating chips to negotiate treaties, stop conflicts, or merge family properties. In order to establish political connections, Helena of Aquitaine, one of the most influential ladies of the Middle Ages, was married off as a teenager. She then wrote about feeling less like a person with her own desires and more like a piece in a chess game. The religious life was a very different difficulty. In order to serve God, monks and nuns vowed to abstain from any romantic love. However, The most intelligent, fascinating people of their era frequently resided in monasteries. Convents. Records from different religious institutions demonstrate that it wasn't always easy to keep these vows, and amorous relationships did arise, frequently resulting in controversy and punishment. The situation was considerably more perilous for those who were attracted to others of the same gender. Such unions were deemed sinful by the church, and civil law frequently imposed harsh penalties. Historians have, however, discovered proof of covert, occasionally years-long same-sex partnerships. This is when the interesting part begins. Romance was not destroyed by these limitations. They made it into something that was nearly legendary. Love becomes legendary when it is outlawed. People in the Middle Ages came up with some inventive ways to communicate their emotions. They devised intricate courtship customs, concealed messages in poetry, and secret codes that might conceal genuine emotion beneath socially acceptable conduct. Some couples used symbolic flower arrangements in which each bloom represented a particular meaning. Others employed acrostic poetry, in which the name of their beloved was spelt out by the initial letter of each line. Some people make up whole fictitious business partnerships merely to have a reason to communicate. It resembled a covert love language that coexisted with everyday life. It's a lovely irony. Some of the most intense and enduring love stories in human history were actually produced by a society that made a concerted effort to manage love. These outlawed romances served as the model for all that we now find romantic. The notion that love overcomes all obstacles. Such passion is worth every hardship. Of two hearts pounding together in the face of insurmountable odds. All the romance films you've ever enjoyed. Every romantic music that has made you shiver. Every tale of genuine love triumphing over adversity. All of them have their roots in these rebellious medieval people who chose to love in spite of a society that declared it was impossible. This leads us to the most well-known, intense and sad of these forbidden medieval romances. The most brilliant minds of the time came together to study and debate in the intellectual center of Paris. The city was teeming with fresh perspectives on human nature, philosophy, and theology, and Notre Dame Cathedral was still being built. Here, one of the greatest philosophers and instructors of his era, Peter Abelard, was set to meet a pupil who was just as smart as he was. Heloise was her name. She was going to be involved in a love tale that was so deep, scandalous, and terrible that people are still discussing it almost 900 years later. She was the niece of a powerful church official. Everything is in their tale. Beautiful love letters that are still studied today. Family betrayal, violent retaliation, forced separation, brilliant brains falling in love, and secret marriage. Most stunning of all, though, was what happened to Abelard. It was so cruel that it permanently altered both of their lives and in some way strengthened their love. Next time, however, we start that amazing tale with two of the brightest minds of their time realizing that sometimes the most deadly love is created by the best minds. Thus, we find ourselves under the shadow of medieval Paris, when intellectual vitality appeared to permeate the very air. It is 1115 in the year. You could hear the most intriguing arguments coming from little rooms, where the world's most brilliant minds convene to discuss anything from the nature of God to the secrets of human reason, if you were to stroll along the winding streets close to Enaram, which was still only a construction site at the time. A man who was literally altering people's perspectives was seated in one of those rooms. Peter Abelard was no ordinary educator. He was a medieval academic rock star. To hear him speak, students traveled hundreds of kilometers. Kings asked him for his counsel. His intellectual prowess was both feared and admired by the church. He was 36, attractive, gregarious, and fully conscious of his own genius. He had what we would now call a huge ego, according to certain historians, but in all honesty, he had every right to have one. Abelard has a remarkable talent for simplifying even the most difficult philosophical issues. He questioned everything, even his own instructors, old philosophers, and church theology. Abler ventured to ask, but why? In a society where most people just accepted what they were told, and that one question was transforming education throughout Europe, no one, not even the brilliant Abelard, anticipated the course our narrative would take. One of the most esteemed church leaders in Paris, Canon Fulbert, was having trouble. Heloise, his 17-year-old niece, was too intelligent for her own good. And that was really risky for a lady in the Middle Ages. She was able to read and write, in languages that most men couldn't: Hebrew, French, and Latin. She read a ton of philosophy books, produced poetry that moved even the most seasoned academics to tears, and had a bothersome way of raising questions that greatly irritated church leaders. Fulbert needed someone who was both intelligent enough to push her boundaries and well-respected enough that her unusual schooling wouldn't make headlines. Someone capable of directing her hazardous intelligence in ways that were acceptable. And in all of Paris, there was basically just one man who met that criteria: Abelard, Peter. Fulbert then presented Abelard with an offer that appeared to be ideal for all parties. In return for living in our home and tutoring Eloise one-on-one, you will receive free rent and use of Paris's best private library. This was like winning the medieval lottery for a scholar like Abelard. However, this is what Abelard would later admit in his writings and what Fulbert was unaware of. The great thinker had a secret agenda. He was aware of this remarkable young lady. He was also curious, not simply in an intellectual sense. The thought of a lady with a mind as sharp as his own attracted him. It was 11:15 on a cool autumn morning when they had their first lesson. Later on, Abelard wrote about this incident in a detail that still shivers me. He told how he first saw Eloise when he entered Fulbert's library. Her eyes were outstanding, not her attractiveness, as modern counts claim. She had a sort of intelligence in her eyes, he said, that appeared to see right through everything, including him. They discussed the notion of universals and the issue of evil after starting with Aristotle and moving on to Ostinine. However, what began as scholarly debate swiftly evolved into something far more hazardous. These were more than just a teacher and a pupil. These two of their generation's brightest minds were learning that the most enticing kind of attraction may be intellectual connection. Later on, Abelard said that he started making up reasons to prolong their classes. For her part, Eloise began to pose more difficult queries that needed more thorough justifications. Their philosophical arguments evolved into literary discussions, which in turn turned into intimate chats, something neither of them had anticipated or been ready for. Their connection was beautiful because it started in their heads before it ever reached their hearts. Here were two people who fell in love with each other's thoughts first, in a society where most marriages were planned without the couple even having a meaningful conversation. However, they were both aware that they were engaging in a very risky game. Eloise's instructor and spiritual mentor was to be Abelard. She was a well-liked niece of a prominent church leader. To further his scholarly career, he took unofficial vows of celibacy. She was supposed to enter a convent or marry her uncle's preferred candidate. Their own letters, which have survived because they are regarded as some of the most exquisite love letters ever written in any language, detail what transpired next. In 1116, as winter gave way to spring, their intellectual allure evolved into an emotional one and then a physical one. According to Abelard, their lessons were frequently used as justifications for hanging out. Their arguments turned into discussions about everything but their true emotions. Then the moment that made all the difference arrived. Heloise asked Abelard a question that had nothing to do with philosophy and everything to do with the way he was staring at her during what was ostensibly a conversation about Plato's idea of love. I promise I'm not making this irony up. All of Abelard's intellectual defenses fell apart in that instant, he wrote later. This person understood his soul as well as his ideas. Someone who could push him, encourage him, and give him the impression that his mind had finally found its soulmate. They met in that library, surrounded by centuries' worth of knowledge on passion, love, and the human heart, and secretly fell in love. What makes their story even more amazing, though, is this. Their intellectual bond remained strong. They continued to write poetry together, argue philosophy, and question one another's beliefs with the same ferocity they brought to everything else, even as their relationship grew more intimate. They were able to conceal their relationship for almost a year. Abelard would show up for class. After giving him a kind welcome, Fulbert would leave them alone with their books and their risky secret. Everything appeared completely appropriate from the outside. Just a terrific teacher and his outstanding pupil pondering life's big concerns. Such potent secrets have a way of coming to light. And when this specific secret came to light, it would ruin lives, put careers on hold, and give rise to one of the saddest love stories in history. As these things frequently do, the end started with the most obvious outcome possible. Heloise discovered she was pregnant in late 1117. Imagine how terrifying that moment must have been. This young lady was bearing the child of a guy who was meant to be her spiritual guide, and her entire future rested on her reputation. If anyone found out that this academic had violated his unofficial vows of chastity, his career would be ruined. Furthermore, if this incident were made public, a prominent church leader would be completely disgraced. However, what transpired next shows that Apal and Eloise are both attractive. They took a decision that reveals their true selves rather than panicking or looking for a means to hide their connection. Love was their choice. They choose one another. They decided to accept the repercussions of their decision. In a tiny ceremony outside of Paris, Abelard quietly wed Heloise. It wasn't socially acceptable since she was meant to marry her uncle's chosen partner, and it wasn't legal in the eyes of the church because he was supposed to be celibate. Nevertheless, they made commitments to one another that they would live out for the rest of their lives. Our story then turns into something so horrific, so medieval, and so startling that it permanently altered the course of both of their lives. For Uncle Fulbert had now learnt of what was going on in his home, and his response was going to be quick, brutal, and utterly medieval in its ruthlessness. The most astounding aspect, however, was that their love story was only getting started despite everything that was about to happen to them, including the violence, forced separation, and total ruin of the life they had planned together. Because the best love stories aren't often about lovers who end up together. They are about individuals who decide to love one another despite all efforts by the outside world to dissuade them. That love was going to be put to the test in ways that would have devastated most people, thanks to what Fulbert did to Abelard on that awful night in 1118. Abelard and Heloise, however, weren't typical individuals. They were going to demonstrate that even the harshest medieval justice cannot separate two souls that genuinely recognize one another. It started like every other night before the night that altered everything. Unaware that Canon Fulbert had finally put the pieces together what was going on beneath his own roof, Abelard was sleeping in his quarters near the cathedral school on a chilly spring evening in 1118, most likely dreaming about philosophy or his secret wife. You must realize that Fulbert felt completely embarrassed, not merely angry. An individual's honor was crucial in medieval civilization, and Abelard had humiliated him in front of the entire Parisian population, the great church official who was unable to defend the virtue of his own niece. The revered canon who had paid the wolf to be there and had been so gullible as to let him inside his home. The events that followed expose a horrifying aspect of medieval justice. Fulbert wanted more than retribution. His goal was to set a precedent that would be remembered for generations to come. He wished to ensure that no one would ever again have the audacity to degrade a family. Cheers. Thus, Fulbert committed a completely heinous act that was also lawful. In the middle of the night, he had a gang of guys break into Abelard's chamber. According to medieval law, what they did to him was considered just punishment. However, it would be seen as one of the most heinous acts of retaliation by modern standards. He was castrated. I know that hearing that is shocking, so allow me to take a minute to reflect, even after 900 years. However, this violence wasn't sporadic. Medieval justice was calculated. Fulbert's removal of Abalad's masculinity was a statement that all members of their society would understand. The penalty was commensurate with the offense. The man would no longer possess the male force that he had used to entice an innocent girl. Ablad barely made it out alive. Surgery in the Middle Ages was just a hunch, and it was seen as remarkable that he survived this vicious attack. However, survival was just the start of his struggle, because a castrated man was more than simply physically degraded in medieval culture. He was ruined in society. Consider it. Abelard had centered his entire identity around his macho appeal and cerebral prowess. Students traveled hundreds of kilometers to hear him as their teacher. The philosopher who was able to defeat anyone in discussion, the man who had tempted Paris's smartest woman. He was suddenly none of those things. In a society that did not accept damaged men, he was a damaged commodity. Like wildfire, the news swept over Paris. In a matter of days, everyone was aware of the fate of the legendary Peter Abelard. Some murmured that his vows were broken out of divine justice. Others remarked it was tragic that a single moment of weakness had destroyed such a brilliant mind. But one thing was universally acknowledged. His career was over. This is the part of this narrative that makes me sad. Abelard didn't think about himself first. Heloise was the recipient. He recalled sleeping in that bed, bleeding and broken, in his later letters. Worried about what this controversy would do to the lady he loved, rather than his own future. Because her reputation was permanently ruined, even though he would eventually get better and start a new life. A woman embroiled in such a controversy had virtually no choices in medieval society. Everyone knew she was ruined. Therefore, she was unable to marry a respectable man. Because the shame would accompany her everywhere, she was unable to reintegrate into society. Her only option was to live out the remainder of her days in religious penance and vanish behind the walls of the monastery. Heloise, however, displayed the fortitude that would make her famous at this point. She responded in a remarkable way when Abelard advised her to enter a convent in order to preserve what remained of her reputation. Her real words, which are preserved in the monastery archives, are what she wrote back. "I would rather be your wife than the wife of another man." How brave must have it been to write those words in 1118. Heloise effectively stated, "I regret nothing. I chose love, and I would choose it again." However, she also recognized the truth of their circumstances in a culture that expected women to be quiet, obedient, and embarrassed of their sexuality. Their covert union was now meaningless. Nobody would notice it. In any case, Abelard's illness prevented it. Their son would have to be reared covertly by Abelard's family. They had named him Astrolabe after a scientific instrument because they were nerds, even down to the baby names they chose. As a result, Heloise made the most tragic choice possible. Not because she felt called to monastic life, but because it was the only way to shield the man she loved from more controversy, she consented to take vows as a nun. To preserve what remained of Abelard's reputation, she would forego her independence, her prospects for the future, and any possibility of happiness. One of the most dramatic events in medieval history was the day Mary professed her vows at the Adjunct convent. Witnesses claim that Heloise recited the customary vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while standing in front of the altar. However, tears fell down her cheeks as she uttered the words that would permanently tie her to the monastic life. Not tears of religious delight, but tears of sorrow for the life she was giving up. Meanwhile, Abelard made a bold decision of his own. After the incident, he was unable to continue teaching in the secular world and entered the Abbey of Santine as a monk. However, it's clear from his letters that he wasn't called to a holy life. He made that decision out of desperation and shame. His heart was still with the woman he would never see again, he wrote, and he felt like a dead man wandering through the rituals of monastic life. Most sad love stories would finish there, with the lovers permanently apart, their ambitions dashed, and their future robbed by the harshness of their surroundings. However, a new chapter in the story of Heloise and Ablad was about to begin. One that would demonstrate that their love was more intense than most people who get to spend their entire lives together, more resilient than societal disgrace, and stronger than physical separation, because this is what their adversaries failed to comprehend. You don't destroy the love between two bright brains who have identified each other as soulmates when you drive them apart. You turn it into something nearly otherworldly. They started writing letters, not just ordinary letters, but letters that were so exquisite, so deep in thought, and so honest in heart that they are being studied in colleges today as the best of medieval literature. These letters were not merely romantic ones. They were a combination of theological discussions, philosophical treatises, and emotional admissions. Heloise wrote to Abelard about her difficulties in religious life, acknowledging that although she carried out her responsibilities as a nun, her heart was entirely secular. She criticized religious authorities, questioned church theology, and talked of her continued love for a guy she was meant to have forgotten. Her correspondence reveals a woman of remarkable integrity and bravery. Ablad reacted with the same intensity of passion, but with the self-loathing and self-doubt that would follow him for the rest of his life. He held himself responsible for both what had happened to her and what had occurred to him. He commented that if it meant she could have had a different life, he would willingly endure his penalty once more. The most amazing aspect of their correspondence, however, is this. It went beyond simply reflecting on what they had lost. Despite being geographically separated, they persisted in intellectually challenging one another, debating philosophy and theology, and developing and learning together. Distance could know. Longer touched the love that had transcended the physical realm. Even during their lifetimes, the letters became legendary as they were copied and circulated throughout medieval Europe. They provide as motivation for other loves. Because of their religious insights, scholars studied them. Even Durr, a church official, secretly appreciated the beauty of their writing, even if he publicly disapproved of their relationship. And it leads us to a person who would question all of our preconceived notions about power, love, and the decisions that women could make in a society that was set up to govern them. Because Ambe, another woman, was completely rewriting the regulations while Heloise and Ablad were penning their hearts out from behind the walls of the monastery. Elena of Aquitaine was about to demonstrate that a woman's refusal to let another person to determine her fate might occasionally be the most potent love story. Before you are 25, picture yourself as the most powerful woman in Europe. That was the reality of Elena of Aquitaine. And believe me, she took full advantage of it, scandalizing the medieval world in the process. Elena, who was born in 1122, became the richest unmarried woman in Europe almost immediately after inheriting the Duchy of Aquitaine at the age of 15. We are discussing regions that comprised around 1/3 of present-day France, extending from the Lire River to the Pyrenees. She was comparable to a young billionaire with her own army in today's terms, and she was the object of everyone's desire to marry. This is what, however, makes Elena's narrative so intriguing. She didn't simply put up with being viewed as a prize. She stated right away that she wanted to be in charge of her own life, marriages, and yes, romantic relationships. Elena's voice was set to reverberate through history in a world where women were expected to be seen rather than heard. Before she had a chance to protest, her first marriage was planned. She was nearly a child when she married Louis XI of France at the age of 15, becoming her Queen of France. At this point, Louis was a respectable enough man, pious, well-intentioned, and utterly overwhelmed by his wife's superior intelligence, riches, and charisma. According to modern accounts, Louis was the type of man who would have been content to live as a monk. His wife had strong views on everything from church reform to military strategy, and he had no idea how to deal with her. He was also quite pious and preferred prayer to politics. Elena, on the other hand, was full of ideas, ambition, and energy that both fascinated and frightened her devout husband. According to all accounts, their 15-year marriage was a study in basic incompatibility. Elena desired passionate love, intellectual stimulation, and adventure. Louis desired quiet, peace, and a woman who would join him in prayer rather than question papal authority during dinner parties. Their mismatch was almost hilarious, akin to matching a meditation instructor with a racehorse. However, personality differences were not the true issue. The main issue was that, after 15 years of marriage, Elena had only produced 2 daughters for Louis and no male heir, which was disastrous in the context of medieval politics. The French court started speculating that their union might have angered God. The marriage might have been doomed. Perhaps Louis needed to locate a new woman who would be able to bear him boys. Elena's identity as Elena was interpreted differently. She concluded that divine disapproval was not the issue. She had married the wrong man, and that was the issue. She also performed something in 1152 that stunned the medieval world as a whole. She separated from the French king. Now, divorce was different in the 12th century than it is now. You couldn't simply divide your assets and file paperwork. You have to demonstrate that your marriage was invalid from the start, typically by making a claim about a distant blood link that was against church law. Because she and Louis were connected to each other to the forbidden degree, Elena was able to have her marriage annulled. They were essentially distant cousins, which was illegal under canon law, but had been conveniently disregarded when the marriage served political purposes. This is where everyone's jaws dropped, though. Elena bargained to retain all of her domains. She kept her wealth, her titles, and her independence when she left her marriage to the French monarch. In a society where divorced women typically found themselves penniless in convents, Elena effectively executed the most impressive prenuptial agreement in medieval history. She subsequently married Henry Plantagenet, who was 11 years. Younger than her, incredibly attractive, and set to become King Henry II of England, just 8 weeks after her divorce was finalized. Her decision sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. This marriage's quickness was scandalous enough, but the husband selection was brilliant. Henry was more than just a pretty young man. He was smart, ambitious, and strong enough to defend Elena's independence without feeling threatened by her strength. Elena's marriage to Henry also meant that her large French territories would now be under the English crown, which made things very difficult for her ex-husband, Louis. This is where it gets wonderfully tricky. The relationship between Elena and Henry was unclear to medieval chroniclers. Some referred to it as a romantic cover for a political collaboration. Some muttered that it was just pure physical attraction between 2 of their age's most extroverted individuals. The few of Elena's own letters that have survived, however, point to something even more intriguing. She had discovered her emotional and intellectual equal. Because he couldn't sit still, Henry II was notorious for his explosive temper, endless energy, and tendency to wear out several horses in a single day. Elena was exactly like him. Her personality had energized Henry, but it had overwhelmed Louis. They formed what was effectively a medieval power couple, discussing politics and organizing military operations together. 8 children were born out of their union, including King John of Magna Carta, fame, and the future King Richard the Lionheart. More significantly, though, it established a collaboration that reshaped the possibilities for women in leadership roles. Elena married more than only Henry. Alongside him, she actively ruled, making choices on everything from international diplomacy to legislative change. This is where Elena's story becomes even more amazing, though. She did something that no other medieval woman could have imagined doing in 1173, at the age of 51 and after 21 years of marriage to Henry. She spearheaded an uprising against her own spouse. One of Henry's highly public relationships was a woman named Rosamund Clifford, whom he had placed in a palace and lavished with riches that belonged to his queen. After years of putting up with his adultery, Elena had had enough when Henry started deciding their son's inheritance without first consulting her. In order to revolt against their father, Elena organized her sons. Raising troops and forging alliances, she personally traversed Aquitaine. According to modern reports, she wore armor, rode at the front of troops, and delivered speeches that stoked fervent devotion. At 51, she was actually spearheading a feminist revolution in the Middle Ages under the pretext of a family conflict. After the uprising failed, Henry had Elena spend the following 16 years in jail. However, she continued to be a formidable opponent even while in prison. Through covert communications, she persisted in influencing politics, kept her supporters loyal, and awaited her opportunity to regain her position of authority. Richard, Elena's son, liberated her after Henry's death in 1189, and he saw right once that he required his mother's political knowledge. Elena started the most adventurous chapter of her life at the age of 67, when the majority of medieval women were regarded as elderly. She negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and once traveled to Sicily to personally accompany her granddaughter to Spain for a royal wedding. Elena's final moments are possibly the most telling of her life's events. She found out that King John was threatening her grandson, Prince Arthur, when she was almost 80 years old. Elena personally oversaw a military operation to defend the boy, in spite of her advanced age. She besieged a fortress and used her sheer willpower to negotiate his release. Elena's insistence on being an equal partner in all of her relationships made her attitude to love revolutionary. She refused to accept male protectionist decisions passively. She had a deep affection, but she had her own rules. She also didn't withdraw into pained quiet when love let her down. She did something to improve her situation. Elena recognized something that many people today are still learning, which is what makes her narrative so contemporary. Power and love don't have to be antagonistic. You have the capacity to be both strong and weak, amorous and strategic, and passionate and political. Despite her intense affection, Elena never allowed it to take away from her feeling of autonomy or self-worth. Speaking about groundbreaking perspectives on love, something that would forever alter. Romantic society was born in Elena's court in Aquitaine, the custom of courtly romance. The majority of people are unaware of the fact that courtly love was essentially a complex game in which knights would fall in love with married women they were never able to have, leading to some of the most intense and unattainable romances in medieval history. Welcome to the strangest dating system ever created by humans, Dara. Just wait till you hear about courtly love, a medieval custom so bizarre, so intricate, and so utterly backwards that it makes reality TV seem simple if you think relationships now are complex. The most innovative thinkers of the time convened at Elena's court in Plataea in the 1170s to essentially ask, what if we made love as complicated and impossible as humanly imaginable? The result was courtly love, a system in which the entire purpose was to fall madly in love with someone you could never have. This is how it went. You'll believe I'm making this up. I assure you, a knight would declare himself a loyal servant of a married noblewoman, typically someone far higher in social standing than himself. Her servant, not her lover, mind you. Even though he was fully aware that his love would never be fulfilled, he would then spend years, even decades, putting on extravagant displays of devotion to prove his value. Like a medieval dating app with the most annoying terms of service in the world, the regulations were quite detailed. Take a moment to consider the following. No one can be bound by a double love, and my personal favorite, a true lover is constantly and without interval possessed by the thought of his beloved. Andreas Capellanus, who wrote The Art of Courtly Love around 1184, outlined 31 official rules that included gems like marriage is no real excuse for not loving. They established a system in which the goal was to make people miserable, where unrequited love was a benefit rather than a drawback, where falling in love with someone so deeply that you never even made an effort to win them over was the pinnacle of romantic success. This is what, however, makes courtly love intriguing rather than merely masochistic. In reality, It was a kind of intellectual and emotional revolt masquerading as amusement. In a world where women had no say in their romantic fates and marriages were business agreements, courtly love provided a forum for women to express their feelings, exercise control over men, and experience love for its own sake. Allow me to introduce you to one of the most well-known courtly love poets, Cretan Troy, who composed for Elelena's court. His tales of knights, such as Lancelot, were more than mere amusement. They were propaganda for revolution. In his stories, the world's greatest knights would forsake duty, honor, and common sense in favor of love. In order to get to Gwaine, Lancelot literally crossed a sword bridge, putting love before his own security. These tales implied that emotional openness might be the ultimate form of bravery in a culture that placed a premium on military skill and masculine power. These relationships gave the ladies a level of power never before seen. He may be asked to do anything by a knight's lady. That he competes in competitions while donning her colors. That he composed her poems. That he goes on perilous adventures only to demonstrate his loyalty. According to legend, Elelena's daughter, Mahachampin, hosted courts of love where aristocratic women would hear cases involving romantic conflicts and make decisions regarding appropriate courtly conduct. This is where things start to get interesting, though. Some of these relationships developed into truly intense engagements that lasted for decades in spite of all the prohibitions against impossibility and purity. Consider the story of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, a German knight who spent 30 years writing poems about a married noblewoman, competing in tournaments for her honor, and pulling off increasingly daring actions to get her attention. Written in the 1250s, von Liechtenstein's autobiography has the style of a love comedy from the Middle Ages. At one point, he traveled around Europe, pretending to be the goddess Venus, and challenged other knights to joust in her honor. As a Valentine's Day gift, he severed his own finger and gave it to his woman in a jeweled box. She reportedly returned it with a note expressing her displeasure. He wrote poems in 3 languages, learned to play musical instruments, and even had what was effectively medieval plastic surgery to hide his hair lip, all in an attempt to get her acceptance. What's most amazing is that she never abandoned her spouse for him. Together, they never fled. For 30 years, they kept up their unworkable connection with Ulrich always hoping and his lady always keeping a safe distance to keep him loyal. Furthermore, they both appear to find this arrangement to be not only bearable but also profoundly significant. Something intriguing has been discovered by contemporary psychologists researching courtly love connections. The majority of medieval marriages lacked the emotional connection that many of these relationships offered. Courtly lovers developed strong emotional and intellectual bonds, but married couples frequently didn't know one another well, and most definitely didn't communicate their innermost thoughts. They formed ties that were frequently stronger than those of many formal marriages, exchanged poems, and talked philosophically. However, the connection between Dante Alighieri and Beatrice Portinari had to be the most well-known courtly romance in history. When Dante and Beatrice first met at the age of 9, they fell in love right away, and he wrote about her for the rest of his life. In all his life, he had spoken to her just twice. She served as the idea for the Sublime Comedy, one of the best pieces of literature ever written, despite having merely 2 chats. Unaware that a guy she had hardly talked to was producing enduring art in her memory, Beatrice married someone else, had children, and passed away young. Despite becoming married to someone else, Dante kept writing about Beatrice as his ideal love and spiritual mentor. He pictured their relationship nearly totally in his mind. Nevertheless, 700 years later, people are still reading the poetry it generated with tears in their eyes. Some of the most exquisite and strange romantic traditions in history were also spawned by the courtly love tradition. As a sign of their commitment, knights would wear gloves, a scarf, mementos from their ladies, and occasionally even their pants into battle. On holy days honoring their beloved, they would observe a fast. Some would swear to carry out a specific number of charitable or good deeds in their lady's honor. Knights are known to have created ornate gardens and commissioned works of art for women who were hardly given credit for their existence. For a woman who was married to his political enemy, a German aristocrat spent a fortune building a mechanical clock that played a different love song every hour. The way courtly love affected real marriages, however, was arguably its most peculiar feature. Blanche of Castile, Elenena's own granddaughter, totally rewrote her marriage to Louis VI of France by utilizing courtly love customs. As if she were an unreachable woman, she refused to accept the usual official royal marriage, which is to say that she must be courted by Louis. Even after 20 years of marriage and 8 children, they continued to write love poems to one another, give and receive romantic presents, and uphold the customs of courtly love. Romantic expressiveness developed an art form as a result of the tradition's proliferation throughout Europe. The most lavish romance feasts were hosted by competing courts. Just as we could commission wedding photographers, nobles commissioned love songs. These medieval attempts to make love both impossible and eternal are the origin of the entire idea of romantic chivalry, opening doors, delivering flowers, and composing love notes. And it leads us to what is arguably the most tragic illustration of courtly love in action. Shakespeare was influenced by the true stories of Romeo and Juliet centuries later. Because some people carried courtly love too far and chose death over life without their unattainable lover, even though it was only meant to be a theoretical concept. These tragedies weren't made up. They were actual people who loved so deeply that they gave their lives, and they left behind such moving tales that we still tell today. You must know anything about Romeo and Juliet. That narrative wasn't made up by Shakespeare. He took it from actual medieval lovers whose misfortunes were so heartbreaking and emotionally stirring that for centuries, before the bard ever put pen to paper, people had been reluctant to share them. The most eerie of these real-life tales originates from Verona in the 13th century. Yes, the same Verona that would later serve as the setting for Shakespeare's play. It wasn't fiction, though. Almost 300 years before Shakespeare was born, in 1281, the Chronicles of Fra Gerardo Bulieri detailed the tragedy of Marot and Januzza's love affair. Gonazza was the daughter of his family's acrimonious political adversaries, while Marot was a young aristocrat from a well-known Versa family. Does that sound familiar? Family conflicts were more than simply personal drama in the city-states of medieval Italy. They were literally life-or-death situations. Italy had been split into warring groups by the Gves and Ghibellines, and picking the wrong side could result in the exile or execution of your entire family. This is what, however, makes their tale much more sad than Shakespeare's. In fact, Marotto and Gionza were able to wed in secret. In a secret chapel beyond the city walls, they located a sympathetic friar who conducted the wedding. Despite the animosity between their families, they continued their improbable romance for 3 months, meeting behind closed doors, exchanging stolen moments, and holding on to the hope that they could somehow make their relationship work. Then, in a street brawl, Marat killed Gonos's cousin. There was no plan. It was not planned. It was the kind of violent outbursts that were common amongst rival families. However, the outcome was disastrous. Marot was expelled from Verona right away, and Gionazza's family proclaimed her engagement to a wealthy Florentine businessman without knowing about the covert union. The subsequent events resembled the most tragic love letter ever composed. Gionazza begged Marotto to come get her in a letter she sent to him via the same friar who had wedded them. The words she penned have preserved in the records of the monastery. "I'd rather die as your wife than live as the wife of another guy. You will find a way to spare me from this worse fate than death if you truly love me, as you have vowed." Marotto's reaction was quick and frantic. Knowing that he would be put to death immediately if he were discovered inside the city walls, he set out on the perilous voyage back to Verona. But he was willing to risk all for love. He traveled largely at night, posing as a pilgrim, and arrived on the outskirts of Verona just as Gheonazza was getting ready for her wedding. The plot of their story, however, takes a turn that is in some ways even more sad than that of Romeo and Juliet. In order to get out of the scheduled marriage and escape with Marotto, Gheonazza had persuaded the same friar to give her a sleeping potion that would make her appear dead. It was an easy strategy. Act as though she has died. She should be rescued from the tomb by Mariotto, and they should flee together to begin a new life away from their warring families. The potion was a complete success. Grieving, Janotsu's family walked to her funeral after she seemed to pass away unexpectedly. However, Marotto never received the telegram informing him that her death was a hoax. Rival family guards intercepted a messenger. Additionally, Mariotto found out about Gheonazza's passing from an outsider who was unaware of their covert scheme. You can see what kind of love medieval people were capable of by what Marotto did next. He broke into the family tomb where Gheonazza was lying in her wedding gown, seemingly dead, rather than running for their lives or admitting that fate had won. The following morning, Marotto's body was discovered slumped over Gheonazza's tomb with an empty vial of poison in his hand, according to the City Watch records. Instead of continuing to live without her, he had decided to die. The most tragic fact, however, is that Gheonazza's body was discovered next to his, and it was obvious that she had woken up from the sleeping spell. The evidence indicated that she had ingested the same poison that had killed Marat, and woken up to find him dead next to her. In an era before dependable message technology, they perished within hours of one another as a result of a communication breakdown that would have been terrible in any century. However, their deaths are not the end of their narrative. Their covert marriage to both families was made public by the finding of their bodies and the love letters in Marot's possession. Something unprecedented resulted from the shock of learning that their children had died for love and that two innocent lives had been devastated by their family conflict. The earliest known peace agreement between rival Italian aristocratic families. Overwhelmed by remorse and loss, both families decided to put an end to their generation-long conflict, according to the Boldi Chronicle. To honor Marot and Gheonazza, they created a combined philanthropic foundation. Additionally, their narrative became a warning about the consequences of family hate that spread throughout northern Italy. However, they weren't the only Romeo and Juliets in real life. There are numerous documented instances of young couples choosing death for separation during the Middle Ages. The tragedy of Pierre de Lusignan and Melisande de Tripoli occurred in France in the 1200s. A crusader political conflict involved two young lords whose families were on opposing sides. Pierre was sent on a perilous journey to the Holy Land after their covert marriage was uncovered, which was widely understood to be practically a death sentence. Within weeks following his departure, Melisande passed away from grief. After hearing of her passing, Pierre purposefully sought death in combat, despite the overwhelming odds. The tale of William Deos and Mud de Clare, whose families were at odds over land rights, is well documented in England. Following the revelation of their covert relationship, Morud was compelled to enter a convent, and William was put in jail at the Tower of London. However, Morud insisted that she was already married in God's eyes and refused to take final vows. Morud chose to starve herself to death rather than take religious vows that would have required her to give up her love for William when he passed away in prison after 3 years. Like wildfire, these tales swept over medieval Europe, recounted by itinerant minstrels, translated into other languages and cultures, and transcribed by scribes. It was always the same subject. Family hostility destroys young love, and lovers choose death over capitulation. It's amazing how these true tragedies impacted not only literature but also real-world social change. After hearing these tales, many medieval societies started putting in place official procedures to settle family conflicts before they turned tragic. When their families disapproved of their weddings, young people could seek assistance in love courts established by certain Italian city-states. After these widely reported catastrophes, the church also started to shift its stance on arranged marriages. Church leaders started covertly offering refuge to young people escaping forced marriages, even though they were unable to publicly challenge family authority. Furthermore, some liberal theologians maintained that God would not accept marriages that lacked sincere agreement. The way these true Romeo and Juliet tales altered people's perceptions of love itself, however, may have had the greatest enduring influence. Prior to these catastrophes, passionate love was frequently regarded as a luxury or a form of amusement. Following the dissemination of these tales, love was viewed as a force so potent that it could motivate the ultimate sacrifice so sacred that giving one's life for it was regarded as honorable rather than foolish. These tales were not merely tragic news that the medieval chroniclers were documenting. They were recording a change in people's understanding of what love was and could be. And now, for something you might not have expected. A completely different kind of forbidden love was taking place, one that was even more perilous, even more covert, and in many respects even more revolutionary than the cross-F familial love stories that were captivating everyone's attention. Because feuding noble families over politics wasn't the only thing that happened during the medieval era. Additionally, it was a period when even Eleanina of Aquitaine would have been uneasy due to the challenges being made to the fundamental definition of what was considered acceptable love. Allow me to share a story of a love so deadly, so impossible, and so scandalous that those involved had to adopt completely new identities just to survive. In medieval Europe, where falling in love with someone from a lower social level wasn't strictly forbidden, this story explores cross-class romance. It was regarded as an assault on the universe's inherent order. What they referred to as the Great Chain of Being served as the foundation for medieval society. A celestial hierarchy that positioned everyone in their rightful position, with peasants at the bottom and God at the top. It was more than simply socially taboo to move up or down this ladder. It was genuinely seen as sinful. The church taught that society was organized into several levels by God himself, and attempting to fight with divine will was equivalent to attempting to love above or below your position. The nobles and the church, however, did not anticipate this. Cosmic hierarchies don't matter to human hearts. The most remarkable example is from England in the 13th century. Lady Margaret de Clare was one of the richest ladies in England, according to King Edward I's court documents. Owner of enormous estates throughout Wales and the Welsh Marches, and a cousin of the king himself. She was supposed to wed a member of the greatest aristocracy, most likely a foreign prince, or at the very least an earl with significant political clout. She fell in love with her groom instead. Not a symbolic groom, but a real one, a man named Thomas, who looked after her horses, cleaned stables, and made almost the same amount of money in a year as Margaret spent on one dinner party. It would be comparable to a contemporary millionaire falling in love with someone who cleaned their stables in terms of social gap. The repercussions were far worse than they were in the Middle Ages. The astonishing thing about Margaret's story is how much we know about it thanks to the complex court actions that ensued. A crisis that reached the king was brought about by the discovery of their covert marriage in 1290. The marriage was seen as so ludicrous that it jeopardized the stability of society as a whole. This is when I get chills, though. Before anyone discovered it, Margaret and Thomas had been secretly married for 3 years. For 3 years, Margaret lived as the wife of a man who was, by all social standards, totally beneath her notice, while feigning to be. Evaluating several aristocratic suitors. The court documents show how they handled it. Margaret would travel separately to see Thomas after sending him on missions to her other estates. To keep their secret, they had established a whole network of lesser clergy and servants. In order to avoid raising suspicions, Margaret even had a phony seal created so that Thomas could communicate with her official correspondence. When the truth was revealed, the response was harsh and quick. King Edward sentenced Thomas to be imprisoned for corrupting a woman of noble blood and ruled their marriage null and void. However, Margaret's action stunned the medieval world. She wouldn't give up her husband. Margaret declared, "I chose love over station, by heart over my heritage, and I would make the same choice again, even knowing the cost, while standing in front of a court of bishops and nobles." This is documented in the official court transcript. It was uncommon for a woman to address the king in that manner. It was revolutionary for a noblewoman to defend her union with a servant. The penalty was harsh. Thomas was permanently banished from England, and Margaret lost the majority of her holdings and titles. Here's what makes their story so lovely, though. Together, they fled into exile. Margaret eschewed wealth and respectability in favor of poverty and scandal. They apparently had happier lives as commoners in France for the remainder of their lives than the majority of nobility who married for political reasons. However, noble women marrying down was hardly the only example of cross-class romance. At times, it was about individuals becoming so haut above their birth that they might completely oppose the system. Consider Jacques Coeur, who began his life as the son of a furrier in the French town of Bourges and rose to become one of Europe's wealthiest men through banking and trading. In addition to being considerably above his position, Agnes Sorel was the official mistress of King Charles III of France when Jacques fell in love with her in 1444. The king's favorite shouldn't have been able to hear from a merchant's son, much less catch her. However, Jacques had grown so rich and influential that he could practically buy his way into the top echelons of society. Their romance was the ideal illustration of how love could totally upend societal calculations in the Middle Ages. Here was a guy who was officially a commoner, but held more riches than most dukes, and a woman who was officially of noble descent, but whose status was wholly dependent on royal favor. The conventional social hierarchy does not easily accommodate either of these. They therefore made up their own regulations. Some of the most exquisite love poetry of the medieval era was created during the approximately 5-year-long affair between Jacques and Agnes. Jacques hired artisans to produce illuminated manuscripts with love messages encoded within. Additionally, it has been said that Agnes wore jewelry with valuable stones set in particular patterns that spelt out his name. However, this tale also exposes the pernicious politics of interclass romance. Jacques was accused of poisoning Agnes after she unexpectedly passed away in 1450. People needed to think that the connection between a merchant's son and the king's mistress had ended in betrayal because it was so dangerous to the status quo, not because there was any proof. After being found guilty in absentia, Jacques escaped to Rome and lived there for the remainder of his life. The only crime he committed, according to modern historians, was love in the aforementioned state, but that was sufficient in medieval times. The archives of a German monastery in the 1200s contain what may be the most heartwarming tale of a cross-class romance. From the noble family, Brother Friedrich was a monk who had vowed to follow his faith. Additionally, Anna was a peasant woman who served in the kitchens of the monasteries. Talking about theology made them fall in love. Despite her apparent lack of literacy, Anna possessed a remarkable innate brilliance that captivated the learnt monk. Due in part to the fact that religious life offered ideal cover for their encounters, they were able to maintain their connection for more than 10 years without being caught. When Friedrich needed to talk about monastery business, he would inadvertently stop by the kitchens, and Anna would invent reasons to bring food to the scriptorum, where Friedrich worked on illuminated manuscripts. The fact that they never attempted to leave the monastery or their individual roles, however, is what distinguishes their story. Rather, they forged a bond that was wholly contained inside the limitations of their impossibility by carving letters onto wooden pieces that Anna could examine while working. Friedrich taught her to read Latin. Friedrich used Anna's understanding of folk wisdom and herbal remedies into his theological writings. When their relationship was eventually uncovered, the abbot found himself in a scenario never seen before. Anna's abilities in running the kitchen and herb garden made her indispensable, and Friedrich came from a family that had made significant donations to the abbey. The abbot chose an unusual choice in lieu of the customary penalty of excommunication and banishment. He let them to stay together, but only under close religious supervision. Any sexual interaction between Friedrich and Anna was rigorously prohibited, but they were allowed to meet once a week in the abbot's presence to talk theology and share their intellectual connection. For more over 2 decades, they upheld this arrangement, establishing what was effectively the medieval counterpart of an intellectual romance under supervision. Monastic scribes documented their weekly chats, which show an incredibly close and loving connection. They talked about everything from practical issues with the cultivation of therapeutic herbs to the essence of divine love. Anna taught me more about God's presence in everyday life than all my theological education, Friedrich remarked. Furthermore, Anna claimed that Friedrich had demonstrated to her that education might be a kind of adoration. All of these tales of interclass love are noteworthy because they made medieval society face the inconsistencies in their own social structure. Why did love continue to transcend social barriers if God had really established them? Why were regular people occasionally more deserving of love than princes if aristocratic blood was really superior? These connections not only questioned, but also altered social norms. The notion that love might transcend societal barriers had gained such acceptance by the end of the medieval era that it was having an impact on actual marriage law. As long as both parties could demonstrate that their love was sincere and unmotivated by money or social advancement, several areas started permitting marriages between people from various socio-economic backgrounds. Another type of forbidden love, however, was still completely prohibited, despite the growing acceptance of cross-class relationships. Most people were unaware of its existence since it was so firmly ingrained in medieval culture. These love affairs, which took place behind the veil of lives that seemed completely normal to the outside world, in the shadow of monasteries and in the coded language of religious texts, challenged not only social boundaries but also the very notions of what constitutes an acceptable human connection. This fact will fundamentally alter your perspective on medieval Europe. People of the same gender shared some of the most intense, long-lasting, and exquisitely recorded love tales throughout this time. Furthermore, I'm not referring to conjecture or reading between the lines. I'm referring to sworn alliances, decades-long romances, and explicit love letters. All of them were concealed in plain sight among the very organizations that formally denounced this kind of love. The medieval church had a harsh and unambiguous stance on same-sex partnerships. Such love was deserving of death, in addition to being wicked. Usually, the punishment for what they referred to as sodomy was stake burning, and even unsubstantiated accusations have the power to completely ruin lives. How, therefore, did same-sex couples not only endure, but occasionally flourish in such a hostile setting? They used their imagination, extremely inventive, bold, and brilliant. Let me tell you about 2 women whose romance is reminiscent of a medieval thriller about a theft. In the early 1600s, Benedetta Carini and Barramea Crelli were sisters at a convent in Pisa, Italy. Although their story was based on methods that same-sex couples had been employing for ages, I realized that technically that is beyond our medieval era. Furthermore, the evidence is so remarkable that it provides us with a glimpse into the true nature of these connections. As the ABBB convent, Benedetta held a position of great authority and responsibility. She provided spiritual advice to a younger nun named Bartimea. To the outer world, their connection as mental students seemed entirely appropriate. However, historian Judith Brown's discovery of convent documents in the 1980s uncovered something remarkable. For more than 10 years, they had been in love. How did they do it? Bartimea had to provide Benedetta with individual spiritual counseling because of his alleged supernatural visions. She persuaded the other nuns that God was communicating with her in trances and dreams, and that these messages had to be deciphered in complete seclusion. Their romance was perfectly concealed for 10 years by their spiritual discussions. Their strategy was brilliant because it turned the laws of the system against itself. Early modern and medieval Christianity placed a great importance on religious mysticism. Therefore, Nobody asked why an abbess would require private time to talk about revelations from God. They came up with a valid religious justification for actions that, if found out, would have resulted in their execution. However, when their relationship was eventually examined in 1619, their tale became much more intriguing. In order to defend their sexual relationship, Benedetta had constructed a complex fantasy world, which the church officials discovered evidence of. She asserted that the spirit of a male angel named Splenditello had taken possession of her during her mystical trances, and that it was this male spirit, not Benedetta, who had made love to Bartimea. Consider this defense's psychological complexity. Benedetta made a theological exception that permitted their love to exist inside acceptable religious categories in a society where same-sex unions were unimaginable. She basically claimed that because she was momentarily possessed by a masculine spirit, their physical relationship was heterosexual. The investigators from the church were totally perplexed. They had unmistakable proof of a sexual relationship between two women, but they were unable to prosecute it because it was enshrouded in such intricate theological assertions. Although Benedetta was eventually relieved of her duties, she was never put to death or even formally accused of sodomy. Though equally inventive, males in same-sex partnerships needed distinct tactics to be seen. The custom of vowed fraternity served as the ideal pretext for male love relationships. Two men would make a lifelong vow of loyalty to one another in front of witnesses during these ceremonial rituals, which were frequently held in churches. Hundreds of these rites were recorded by the eminent historian John Boswell from medieval church documents, and many of them use language that is distinctly romantic. Partners pledged to share all material possessions, love one another more than anything else, and never be apart in life or death. The sharing of communion wine from the same cup and the exchanging of rings were even part of some rites. The most well-known instance is from Constantinople in the 12th century, where Callistos and Archios underwent a pledged fraternity rite that was well documented. They shared a single bed and a single table for the rest of their lives, according to the church record, which also states that they were linked in soul and body. The same tomb in which they were interred bears the inscription, "Here lie two men who loved each other as Christ loved the church." While contemporary historians question whether these partnerships were always sexual, the wording employed implies that many were unquestionably romantic. It is evident that sworn brotherhood offered a framework for males to have personal relationships that were acceptable in society and could endure for many years. Anselm of Canterbury, who went on to become a saint, and his relationships with different young monks are the most well-known example from Western Europe. The fervent language used in Anselm's emails to his cherished friends would make contemporary romance novels blush. Now, the Church has always maintained that Anselm's relationships were exclusively spiritual. He wrote to a monk named Gandalf, "I yearn for you with my whole heart. I long to see your face and hear your voice, for I am sick with love for you." He did, however, utilize language that was strikingly comparable to modern love poetry. He wrote about bodily longing, about emotional devotion that transcended all other worldly bonds, and about restless evenings spent thinking about his lover. It's interesting to note that Anselm's ardent friendships were not only accepted but also praised by his peers. He rose to prominence as one of the most admired religious leaders of his time, indicating that, as long as it was presented in a way that was acceptable to the Church, the medieval Church was more accepting of same-sex emotional closeness than we might have thought. However, the practice of gender-bending saints and religious leaders was arguably the most creative way to address the issue of same-sex love. Stories of males taking on feminine religious positions and women disguising themselves as men to enter monasteries abound in medieval Christianity. People whose romantic preferences or gender identity didn't fit into traditional classifications found role models in these stories. The most well-known instance is Saint Marinos. In reality, it was Marina, a woman who spent her whole adult life as a male monk. Marina had feelings for another monk. For more than 20 years, they were in a loving relationship, and Marina's true gender was kept a secret until her passing. Because of her dedication to convent life, she was proclaimed a saint rather than condemned when her identity was made public. These gender-bending saints weren't only made-up figures. They frequently drew inspiration from actual persons who had managed to lead genuine lives while adhering to social norms. Their stories' preservation and celebration indicates that medieval society was more tolerant of sexual and gender variety than would be implied by official church dogma. In the Middle Ages, same-sex couples employed extremely complex survival techniques. They devised ways to coexist openly while preserving tenable justifications for their relationships, established support systems within religious organizations, and developed coded languages for communicating their emotions. Some male couples started their own businesses, sharing homes and money in ways that appeared very normal to others. In order to live in the same community for the rest of their lives without anybody questioning their close connection, some ladies joined convents together. In order to express who they really were within socially acceptable spiritual frameworks, some persons took on religious personas of the other gender. The most amazing thing is that many of these partnerships were not only accepted but also honored in their local communities. It appears that medieval people were aware that love may take many different forms. Furthermore, those forms were frequently accepted rather than denounced, as long as they could be articulated within boundaries that were deemed acceptable by society. Something lovely about the inventiveness and tenacity of people is revealed by these untold love tales. People continue to love even when it is prohibited. They simply become more adept at concealing it, safeguarding it, and figuring out how to keep it alive in harsh conditions. And it leads us to what was arguably the most intricate and perilous kind of medieval forbidden love. Relationships that went against not only gender norms and social bounds, but also religious ones. Since human hearts were forging bonds that went beyond the greatest ideological split of the medieval era, Christian Europe was formally at war with Muslim Spain and the Holy Land. Imagine having such a profound love for someone that you would risk your everlasting soul in addition to your life. In medieval Europe, when interfaith romance was not just socially taboo, that was the reality for those who fell in love across religious lines. It was regarded as heresy and was punishable by death, exile, or excommunication. Religious strife characterized the medieval period. For centuries, the Crusades had been in full swing. In Spain, Christian soldiers were engaged in combat with Muslim forces, and the church preached that people of different religions were God's actual enemies. In this situation, falling in love with someone who practiced a different religion was more than just a social transgression. It was entering a hostile area. Here's what, however, makes these tales so remarkable. Nevertheless, they took place, and among the most fervent, well-recorded, and impactful love tales of the Middle Ages were those involving Christians, Muslims, and Jews who put love ahead of the most profound conflicts of their era. The most well-known example is from Al-Andalus, a district of Muslim Spain in the 12th century that was a spectacular mingling of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultures. The romance between Zida, a Muslim princess from Seville, and Diego López Daro, a Christian knight from northern Spain, may be found here. Diego wasn't meant to fall in love with Muslims. He was meant to be battling them.